Good evening, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. On August the 29th, 2021, the U.S. carried out a drone strike in Kabul, Afghanistan, in retaliation over an ISIS-K bombing attack. We were told it was a righteous strike, but as the media probed the matter, it was quickly exposed as anything but. 10 people were killed, including 7 children. Far from targeting an ISIS-K bomb maker, the Pentagon had targeted Zomari Ahmed, an aid worker who had hoped to come to the U.S. on a visa. In a rare move, the Pentagon had to admit what it had done. The Cobble strike joins a list of other U.S. so-called retaliatory strikes, like the 1998 bombing of a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory in retaliation for al-Qaeda attacks on U.S. embassies, a 1993 strike on Iraq that killed 9 civilians, including the artist Lala al-Artar, in retaliation for a questionable, at best, plot to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush, and a 1986 bombing of Libya, this one in retaliation for the bombing of a West German discotheque, which killed 40 people, including possibly Muammar Gaddafi's infant daughter, as a retaliatory strike based on flimsy pretenses that had civilian casualties that did not strike its target. Many are shocked by the senseless and needless deaths of innocents in Kabul, as they should be. But the reality is that the impact of U.S. drone warfare on civilians has been known for some time. Drone warriors, like on our panel tonight, those who live on the other side of U.S. drones, journalists and activists have all raised concerns. General Milley has said himself about the Kabul strike, "We went through the same level of rigor that we've done for years." Tonight's panel hopes to contextualize what happened in Kabul with what we know about the U.S. drone program. I want to say a brief word about how this panel came together. Defending Rights and Dissent is a domestic civil liberties organization. We have expressed opposition to drone strikes as an illegal form of extrajudicial executions, but the bulk of our work concerns free expression and the First Amendment. Over the past several years, we have been involved with raising awareness of the case of Daniel Hale, yet another whistleblower charged under the Espionage Act, this time for working with the media to alert the public about the true nature of drone warfare. Hale is currently imprisoned by the Biden administration. In the process of working around Hale's case, we met and worked with other whistleblowers from the U.S. drone program, including 2 of the people on tonight's panel. As we discussed as a staff at Defending Rights and Dissent, the horrific revelations of the Kabul strike, we commented amongst ourselves how we noted that we were not hearing any of these voices in the media, and we had to wonder amongst ourselves if the media had given greater platform to drone whistleblowers than government officials, generals, and commentators conveniently on the payroll of arm manufacturers and defense contractors, perhaps there would be greater skepticism about drone strikes and a more honest understanding of how the events in Kabul were not that different than other drone strikes we routinely carry out. As an organization that has for 6 decades defended your right to know and freedom to act, we felt an obligation to bring you these voices. I will note there is another set of voices often ignored by the media, who are also not on this panel. To people who live on the other side of U.S. foreign policy, the nature of U.S. warfare is no secret. With that, I introduce to you Lisa Ling. Lisa is a former Air Force technical sergeant who worked with the drone program. Kagan Miller, who is a Navy veteran who worked at NSA Georgia as a CTT in support of various missions with NSA, CIA, Special Forces, including the Libya mission in 2011, anti-piracy missions in Somalia, and drone strikes in Yemen. Sean Westmoreland, who is a former drone program communication technician in the U.S. Air Force who served in Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan, and Christopher Aaron, who is a former intelligence officer for the CIA and the Department of Defense drone program. He deployed twice to Afghanistan and Iraq from 2006 to 2009, serving as a liaison between military special operations and the intelligence community in Washington, D.C. Before I ask the first question, I've been asked to read a disclaimer from Jesselyn Radick, a whistleblower attorney at Exposed Facts Whistleblower and Source Protection Program. None of today's guests we'll be discussing classified or otherwise protected national defense information. We've discussed on previous programs why that is. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I know this is a really dark topic, but I think it's really important that the American public learns what their government does in their name. My first opening question for all of you: you're all veterans of the drone program. You all went on to become outspoken critics of the drone program. What turned you against the U.S. drone program? I guess we'll start with Lisa.
So what turned me against the drone program is I'm not necessarily against the entirety of the drone program. What I am against is the weapons that are placed on drones, because we're supposedly fighting a war on terror. And imagine right now if you in the public had drones that flew over your head for 12, hours and more, days, weeks, months, and years, and everybody around you was susceptible to a strike. There's not a uniform that you can wear. There's not a job you can do. There's not a flag you can wave. People on the ground have waved white flags and children, and they've still been droned. Basically, what we would like to see happen now is for the weapons to be removed from drones. When they were just surveillance drones, the people on the ground that I spoke to did not have the same feeling towards them or the terror from them until the United States decided to arm them. And even the first time that the drone was used in a strike, it was a failure.
Sean, would you like to explain what drove you to become a critic of the drone program?
I wasn't entirely raised in the United States. I lived in Armenia for a period of my childhood, which was, they had dealt with an economic collapse, and they had just finished a war with Azerbaijan. I saw a lot of kids as refugees. We used to sing at orphanages where, you'd have like cradles full of kids that were just, neglected. And I went to Afghanistan, as I joined the military, hoping that I was doing the right thing. I went there, and, I found myself in a position where we were more or less touching every airstrike that happened over Afghanistan for a period of time. I felt like there was a fundamental lack of sensitivity with people who were involved in the program. There's no cultural understanding, and I don't think that a policy of waging war from abroad, from a distance, or just the war there in general, I just felt was misguided. I had a lot of reservations for that. But I do think we're moving into a world where distance is going to become more pronounced. There's going to be, more roles where people are, more or less affecting people's lives, from, not in the local area. And I think it's dangerous, and I think we need to really sit down and think about it before we just let it happen.
Thank you for that. Kagan, do you want to share what led you to become a drone critic?
Well, I think the most important thing is just understanding. I love what Sean said about cultural understanding, because the most important thing is, for me as an analyst, was to try to understand the situation on the ground. And that includes understanding the people and their lives and how they live. And it just seemed like none of that mattered once the strikes are over. And as somebody who spent time in AmeriCorps before I was in the Navy, working on disasters, I got to really understand, what do you do after something happens? And it's not something that people think about. Like, people don't think about what is the neighborhood like? How do people live their lives after this? Like, it was all just about do the mission and then move on. And there was never any follow through. There was never any like, is this making things better? And to me, that was the frustrating part, was to try to ask people, like, how effective are we? Are we doing anything here that's making things better for us or for the people on the ground? And nobody could ever answer that, you know, and you basically get in trouble for asking those kind of questions. And I didn't like that.
Christopher, I believe you're last.
Yeah. Thank you, Chip, for the opportunity to be on the show, first of all. And I would just say, to echo a little bit what Keegan just said, for me, it was my own experience. It was from my first deployment in 2006 to my second one 2.5 years later in 2009. I saw with my own eyes that even though we were, quote unquote, you know, getting the bad guys, killing the bad guys with these drone strikes, we were losing control over vast areas of Afghanistan. We lost the entire southern province of Kandahar between those 3 years, yet we were still reporting, and the news was still reporting these successful kills. You know, so the strategy was failing, let alone the humanitarian side of things, which we never saw because we were on the other side of the wire, but we could only imagine in our dreams. And then finally, I would just say what I saw with my own eyes that was improving was the infrastructure on the bases, you know, the number of McDonald's that were being built on the base, the barracks, you know, the beds, the internet cafes, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly there was money being made and funneled in there. But as far as the strategy of the war, it was a failing strategy that I could observe going back all the way to 2009, let alone, you know, the fact that these military generals are only apparently realizing that here in the last 12 months.
Thank you for that question. And then my second question, I want to sort of delve in a little bit about the experience of being a drone whistleblower before discussing the Kabul strike. As I mentioned before, I know some of you on this panel through our work through defending Daniel Hale, who is in prison for telling the truth about the drone whistleblower program. And as I was putting together my notes for this evening, I recalled a protest I was at Fort Meade when Chelsea Manning was being court-martialed. I grew up about 10 minutes outside of Fort Meade that thought that there'd be a big anti-war protest there ever was like a most preposterous thought you could have told me, but there was when Chelsea was being court-martialed. And I remember one of the speakers, I wish I could recall her name, saying, you know, I was a drone operator and there are many more people like me who want to speak out, but prosecutions like those of Chelsea Manning, you know, are scaring people into silence. So I guess my question for you, as drone whistleblowers, as people who want to tell the public about the reality of drone warfare, what are the biggest barriers you face? What are your biggest concerns in doing so? And I'm going to start with Sean this time.
I would say a general lack of apathy. I mean, we have a lot of sectors of our economy and, you know, just the American way of life that people don't want to look at. I mean, if you take the meat industry, for example, like nobody wants to know where their sausage comes from. Nobody wants to know what goes into their foreign policy or what affords us this, you know, sort of privileged existence of being an American, which, you know, for a large part of the country, it's not exactly felt because that privileged existence is pretty much concentrated in, you know, the hands of a few military industrialists and, you know, financial sector types. But I think that's mainly it. There isn't this sense of collective responsibility in the public. But to add to that, I mean, this 1917 Espionage Act is it's very arcane and it's not appropriate for going after people today, because it's not like we're going and selling information to the Russians or anything. We're just trying to expose what you know, our own country is doing, and, you know, which ultimately leads to blowback and costs the American public more. So, you know, it's a necessary function, and there isn't any appropriate channels to really address this internally, nor is there oversight.
Could you briefly explain the concept of blowback? I know when I do these interviews, blowback is a term that's often used by people who have been in intelligence and the military, and I understand it from the Chalmers Johnson books, but I don't know if everyone still knows that term. Could you give a brief description of what you mean by blowback?
Well, I mean, 9/11 was an example. You know, Osama bin Laden was radicalized by the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. You know, after we had supplied arms to Saddam Hussein to fight the Iranians, which was after we launched a coup against the Shah of Iran. And these situations that we keep finding ourselves have consequences that ripple into the future. And, you know, we have this tendency to just kind of like, you know, commit these actions and then forget about them. And, you know, of course, the people who've had, you know, offenses against them definitely remember them, and they don't forget them. And I mean, we went to war in Afghanistan to go after, you know, a handful of you know, people who were involved in the 9/11 strikes. And I mean, now we have, I think the number I heard from Lisa, she said like 56 terrorist organizations around the world now that are offshoots of Al Qaeda. So I mean, clearly our policies aren't working.
Lisa, what are some of the biggest barriers that drone whistleblowers face?
One is, before we get out of the military, what we hear in the military is you can't say anything. When Chelsea Manning's revelations came out, everyone was talking about them inside, behind the wall, right, where I worked, and you couldn't, you know, don't read them, don't look at them. You have this clearance, and you've made this, you know, this pact that you weren't going to say anything. And when you talk about that, like a lot of people say that I've taken an oath to silence. I did not take an oath to silence. I took an oath to the Constitution. I took an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, for the actual work that I did while I was within the program, within the drone program. And I mean, just to get back with some of the blowback from what Sean was saying, what we're talking about here is intergenerational. I mean, there are people on the other side of the water that have only seen a drone from the United States. They've only seen, and people don't realize this, but when the drone strike happened in Kabul, when they were talking about people's parents, and this is a difficult thing and it may be triggering to some people, but we in America, we need to know this. They were actually picking up the parts of their family and they didn't know what was what. Imagine this. Imagine that this is like the only part of America you ever become aware of when you're 10, when you're 15. When you're, you know, and so to think that these people are to have this idea, I always hear that people over there hate us. They hate our way of life. No, they don't think about us. They think like, I mean, I don't necessarily in my daily activities think of everybody over there all the time either. What I want is what everybody wants, a nice, peaceful, comfortable way of life. And that does not include drones surveilling you, or drones in the air, or drones killing innocent civilians.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you mentioning your oath to the Constitution. I know many times when we talk to whistleblowers, they mention that oath. I know when I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg, he mentioned that oath was very important to him, and how he was very moved when Snowden talked about that oath. I know Thomas Drake, who I think many of us know on this panel, was just sort of a very stand-up, heroic guy, constantly talks about it. You know, I took an oath 4 times to the Constitution. I wasn't going along with that. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I don't think people who aren't whistleblowers necessarily realize how important that oath is to the people who become whistleblowers. Keegan, do you want to tell us what some of the barriers with drone whistleblowers face?
Well, as Lisa mentioned, there's so many disincentives for you to seek help, right, when you're in. And for me, like, my command was like 1,400 people. And we had a chaplain, and that was it. The only person that we could talk to was a chaplain. And most people are afraid to speak when you're in because there's so many red flags that can happen when you could lose your clearance just by talking to somebody. Like, that's a disincentive for anybody to seek help, to seek thinking about the way that they're doing their work. And I think a lot of people that are used to seeing what war is, and they assume, it's two people shooting at each other, and that there's an understanding that somebody might die. But with remote combat, it's not like that. It's just you're thousands of miles away, and you're watching somebody get killed, and you've been a part of this process, or you're doing the action, and then you just move on. And then you do that again and again and again. And a lot of people, when they go on deployment, there is a process to deployment. There is a pre-deployment cycle, there's deployment, there's post-deployment. When people are on deployment, there's a kind of solidarity because everybody's in the same boat. But when your job is to just sit at a computer and do stuff thousands of miles away, and you have to do that every day, and then you go home and you have to think about that, like, that was the craziest thing for me. It was like, oh, I have to do this work, and then I go home and I have my 20-minute drive home to like process what happened to me that day, and then I have to go walk my dog or do the laundry or whatever. And it sounds like they're trying to put in some mechanisms to make it a little easier, at least in the Air Force. I know that they've started including some psychiatrists in certain shops, but for the most part, everybody just does the work. And then when you get out, or then when you have the time to think about it, you don't know what to say. And I mean, transitioning out of the military is a very isolating experience. It's very alienating. And when you have to then think about the process by how you got to where you were and the things that you were part of, you don't really get to do that when you're in it because you're so focused on the mission. You don't get the time to relax and like really contemplate what you're doing. But when you're out, that's what you have to do. Like, that's the whole point of getting out, is like, what did I do? What was this thing I was a part of? And it's just hard. It feels really alienating when you think one way and most of the people that are around you don't even think about it. In fact, they're cheering, like, I'd be in a room and people are like cheering and high-fiving each other, and they're so excited about what happened to it, like, is what's happening. And I just, like, I could never be that way. I couldn't help but think about the people on the ground and what their life is like when they have to deal with this all the time. And then just like, how would I feel if I was in that person? Like Lisa said, like, how would I feel if I had to deal with some machine that was just going around all the time and like randomly attacking my neighbors?
And then Christopher, you're last again. I'm sorry. I'm trying to change up the order every time. But somehow you have been called on last twice in a row now. What are some of the barriers that drone whistleblowers face, Christopher?
It's no worries at all with the order. But I would just say that the real challenge is that there are vested interests in keeping us as a nation and as a world in a state of war. The drones happen to have become one of the primary ways that we stay in this sort of perpetual war, because every time you blow someone up on the other side of the planet, you spawn 5 or 10 new people that hate us. And so there are vested interests, not only from the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about 70 years ago, but also from the human political control structures in the world. And so, we're up against that, but I think there needs to be recognition that we as drone whistleblowers are facing some of the similar things as any of the speakers on human rights throughout the last 100 years have faced, you know. So it's not just us, and I'm not comparing us to some of those incredible examples such as Martin Luther King or even John F. Kennedy, you know, these champions of human rights in the last 2 generations. But in some small way, we are facing similar blowback as anyone who speaks out on these topics does.
I really appreciate all of your perspectives. What do you want the American public, the American people, to understand about the U.S. drone program? Kagan, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I feel like you said it in the beginning. I mean, General Milley said that we followed all of the rigors. You know, we followed all the procedures, and that's exactly the problem. Is that the procedures are the problem. The fact that it's become such a machine now of just, here's the process, let's go through it. And at what point do we as Americans ever get a say in how any of this happens? You know, none of us do. Like, everything is through FISA. Everything is through these like secret courts and secret judicial decisions that regular people never get to be a part of. It never gets debated in the public sphere, which I feel like we've gotten so used to that in America, of just war just being something that is around. But so many Americans don't even think about it because it doesn't affect them. It doesn't affect their daily life. And it's not about wanting it to get to that point where it does affect their daily life, but we still have to be able to think about other people and like, okay, is what we're doing overseas impacting us negatively? Is it affecting our ability to go in the world and be this supposed leader of the world and this arbiter of freedom and democracy? And I mean, that's a question everybody has to ask themselves. For me, I don't think that it is. And I honestly don't understand how anyone who has been a part of this program or even just tangentially around it can say that it has been good for the image of America.
Christopher, what do you want the American people to know about the drone program?
It's just not the targeted killing machine that it's made out to be. I've seen plenty of statistics, that show the number of innocent casualties, and we could repeat those. But the truth is, no one has the final answer as to how many of the targets were quote unquote legitimate and how many were innocent casualties. But you almost don't need to know that, because you can see the bottom line, which is that the policy, the program as it stands, the policy of dropping bombs on people on the other side of the earth, whether or not they hate us already, results in more of that hatred. So the policy is just a flawed policy, whether we're using the drones or otherwise. And I just wish we could have a discussion. I mean, I know this sounds crazy and this is going to seem like a hippie tree hugging kind of idea, but I wonder if as a nation, if we were to try something like, instead, if we just created a policy, we're no longer dropping bombs from planes. Instead, we're going to just try, let's say for the next 5 years, we only drop food, medicine, and clothing on people on the other side of the planet, and just see how people respond, whether or not people appreciate it or continue to hate us. I don't know. I think it's worth a try, given that we've seen what 20 years of dropping bombs does, which is a failure on all levels.
No, and I really appreciate you using the phrase targeted killing. I mean, the euphemisms that our government uses are so misleading. It's targeted killing, it's surgical strike, it's smart bomb. And one of my earliest, I think, political memories is being a child at my grandmother's house before elementary school and just watching on CNN that green night vision camera they used to put on. This is during Clinton, of us just dropping bombs on Iraq. And I just, I think, and then during shock and awe, we were told they were using smart bombs, and then it was surgical strikes, and now they're doing targeted killings. And time again, we see the bombs aren't that smart, the strikes aren't that surgical, and the killing isn't that targeted. And I don't know what euphemism they'll come up with next, but it doesn't seem to really ever change the reality that we're getting a lot of innocent people. Lisa, what do you want the American people to know?
So there's a couple things. One is that this has become normative. The idea of bombs dropping, missiles striking, that this has become normative. The other thing that's become normative is has to do with acquiring targets, has to do with basically the acquisition of data, and the idea that you can be a distance away and get data, right? And that this is going to make you somehow situationally aware to what is happening on the ground. That somehow these, like, what I really want America to know is what happened in Kabul. The innocent civilians that were killed. The car was spotted outside of an NGO, a California, United States NGO. And no one could distinguish this from a quote-unquote terrorist who was imminently, which is a word that is not even defined, going to strike us. And I'd like to also point out that we supposedly, quote-unquote, killed some target with completely erroneous data, and no strike has occurred to this day. So all of this arbitrary collection of data from cell phones, from, you know, I mean, trying to do facial recognition from something that flies over your head, the whole idea of it is ridiculous. All they needed to do was get the license number of the vehicle and see who owned it. Or maybe put a no strike list on United States NGOs that work with NSAID, or NSAID, that was a Freudian slip if I ever heard one.
I know, yeah.
But I mean, basically, we could put a, like, no, we can't even have enough data to put a no bomb order on hospitals. Like, we've bombed hospitals, soccer games, weddings. Like I said, nobody is immune to a strike, which tells me the data is faulty. They had 2 artificial intelligence bots placed on social media, and they couldn't even control that. And yet we're under this misguided idea that we're doing these amazing surgical strikes and these amazing, you know, that we have like this godlike omnipotent knowledge because we can fly a plane remotely over a situation or suck in data from multiple sources. If you don't have situational awareness, you don't have cultural competency. What they said about this one specific strike, we can talk about this one strike being just like every other strike. We followed this car. What about Porto, the Italian that was droned after they flew over that one site and didn't know that there were any Westerners there for a number of days? This isn't what happened in Kabul, is the norm. It is utterly normal that we think that what they're doing is different for some reason. When this gentleman, whose family and himself got droned and killed and just like cut to shreds, was doing what he did every day of the week for an American NGO. I mean, just let that sink in, America. How accurate are we?
Thank you. That was a really moving answer. Kagan, what do you want the American people to know?
Really just, we have to look at foreign policy through a microscope. We have to look at every decision that's made to kill people with the absolute, like, microscope. We have to look at it and realize that when people die, we have to be responsible for it. And if we're not responsible, if we just, we make dehumanizing comments or whatever, that's the problem, is that the people in the program they don't see them as people. They see them as targets. They see them as whatever euphemism you want to use. And it's like, that's just not true. They are people. They have lives. They have families. They have, so they have a life just like anybody else does. And if we're going to make the decision to kill people, we need to be absolutely sure that it's for a better reason than just because we can. And to me, and what I've been a part of, that's the way that I feel like it has been. It's just a continuation of it. And if we need to start putting the power of war back in the hands of Congress and let the people debate it.
That's an excellent idea. And Defending Rights and Dissent has been very supportive of efforts of those few Congress members who want to take back their war powers and assert some control over our foreign policy. My next question is obviously the one that's the reason we're all here tonight. Based on what you know about the drone program, how surprised are you by the Kabul strike? That was not a righteous strike. The civilians were not just people in the wrong place at the wrong time. We had they were in the wrong place, but they weren't just, around the target. We completely had the wrong target. We completely had the wrong person. We killed 10 people, a U.S. aid worker, and 7 children. Based on what you know about the drone program, how surprising was the revelation that what the Pentagon had told us about the Cobble strike were complete lies? Christopher, I'll start with you this time.
Thank you. I'm surprised at the severity of the number of casualties. It's really extreme in this case. In my past experience, when we had mistakes such as this, it was more on the order of like 1 or 2 innocent casualties per strike. Not that that's any less significant, but at least the numbers were not as catastrophic. So I'm surprised at the numbers, to be honest. But it almost in some sort of way seems ironic that our parting strike, as we are ending this war, literally is in the order of magnitude of the most severe mistakes that we've made. I don't want to say that was intentional, but it sure seems like somewhere there in the chain of command, there was someone saying, let's be incredibly brazen as we go out of this theater. And so in that kind of way, based on what I saw, it's not entirely surprising.
Lisa, what's your reaction to this question?
So I'm absolutely surprised. I mean, I know that the award that I got said that 121,000 lives were impacted in the 2-year period that I was participating in what that was gleaned for. And so the numbers are often skewed. And like what you said earlier is we will never know. But I'm not only surprised at, I'm not surprised at all that we got the wrong target, that we had faulty data. Sean and I wrote a chapter for a book that's coming out in November by Disruption Labs, and we clearly explain, the stuff that's public, and how it's broken, right? But what I'm really surprised about is why it is that America is not more shocked, is not more disturbed at how normative the idea of killing, I mean, let's be real, killing Muslims has become in the United States. How we don't even blink. And it just seems like, yeah, the news cycle came, the news cycle went. We had a hearing about it where the highest ranking officer in the land basically spoke to how this is broken and how it doesn't work. And there's silence, radio silence. And it's people like you who, you know, thank you for giving us a platform to.
Can anyone else still hear me? Oh, hello.
So, yeah. Anyway.
Okay, and then, Kagan, can we get your response to the question?
I like what Christopher said, because we just had a bunch of people die, right, in this bombing in Kabul. And to sit there and think that the military is always objective and it doesn't take into account when something like that happens is just not true. I mean, we're human. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all think like a person, so we get emotional. And when people are in positions of power to make something happen, of course they're going to do that. And so I can totally agree that there was probably somebody that was like, we need to hit them back. We need to do something in response to this. And when that happens, the community, the people in the intelligence community can get caught up in that too. And it's really hard when you want to try to be objective and take the emotion out of it. But there's a lot of people that aren't willing to do that because they just want to do something. They just want to respond. And what's the way to respond in the military is to bomb something. And I just feel like it's just so indicative of the way that this program has evolved, you know, is that it's just become something that people do, and that it's something that America does. And like Lisa said, killing Muslims is not a thing anymore that people really care about in America. And I get really tired about that.
I'm back. I got kicked out for a minute. I'm not sure how or why. Sean, what's your reaction to the Kabul strike? Sean, you're on mute.
I said I'm not surprised at all that happens. It's happened numerous times in the past. The usual response is like kind of just sweep it under the rug. But really the only reason the New York Times was able to extensively investigate that in the manner that it did was because there was CCTV footage of it, and they could cross-reference it with, you know, what the military was reporting. So, you know, it's that's not available in, you know, rural areas, and you know, it's not in the center of Kabul as we're pulling out. It was hard to watch, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know what I got for you, but that's about it.
Yeah, it's upsetting. I guess, you know, we've known for years throughout all of our wars that the U.S. considers civilian casualties to be, you know, quote unquote collateral damage. They're just sort of the incident to doing war. But how often is it that the U.S. doesn't just kill civilians when attacking a target, but completely gets the wrong target, like they did with the Kabul strike? Just someone not who they said it was, just totally wrong. And I don't know who wants to answer that one. I'll let whoever wants to take it at this point.
Well, in the film National Bird with the strike in Erzincan, I think it was Erzincan. Yeah, 23 civilians were killed. It was one of the few occasions that any, you know, high level, you know, military official came out and apologized for it. But you know, in the film, it walks you through, you know, what might have been the problem. It's also quite revealing when you read the transcripts and you see the attitudes of the people that were actually, you know, conducting the strike. And I wouldn't, you know, I would wager to say that's not unusual.
Does anyone else want to take this question?
I can say that ECCHR and others have done investigations
And
on.
that's the European Center for Constitutional Rights, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure when we use acronyms, people know what they are.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so used to them.
No, I'm used to interrupt people when they use acronyms and spelling them out. So that's what I'm here to do.
But I mean, they've basically, I think it's the Center for Independent Journalism and others have investigated strikes, and what they found out is that people have been killed multiple times. And if you look at the number of times that that's happened, you can get an idea that perhaps there may be an issue with targeting.
And then do you
I will say.
Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I mean, as somebody who worked on missions in places where there wasn't like a huge human footprint, you know, it's harder. It's so much harder. And even General Milley said this the other day too, that when you don't have a person there, there's no heart, is what he said. You know, that there's no human elements to be there. And when it's just data, like data does not tell the whole story. You know, context is important. And when you're just going off of data, you're just going off of certain signals collection, there's so many ways for that to be wrong. And the way that it's gone around, you know, it's just that part is never really discussed. And so that's what frustrated me the most about being in the program. It's like, how do we know what we're doing is actually, you know, how do we know that we're prosecuting the right target or whatever? It's like, because somebody's phone, like, you know, it's just, there's so many ways for things to be not necessarily manipulated, but there's ways for things to be wrong, especially when you don't have a person there on the ground to actually tell you, you know, yes, I see this person. And that just, you know, that's part of it.
And then Christopher.
Yeah, I just think, although it's an important question, and although we're looking at this from the technology standpoint, everyone wants to know, how accurate is the technology? Is it, you know, is it 50%, 95%, 99%? These are important questions, but I think if we really take a step back, I think it ultimately doesn't matter, because when you look at the way the technology is being used, and you just, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that where we would even have a successful strike against, let's say, hypothetically speaking, the leader of a madrasa in a remote area close to the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, you know, the teacher at a religious school who is on our list as being somehow associated with the Taliban, yet is the teacher for 10 boys between the age of 8 and 13. And that guy goes out into the field to relieve himself, and he's blown up in front of his 10 students. I mean, so that was a strike that we would count as 100% accurate, no innocent casualties whatsoever. But whereas we previously had one extremist, we now have 10 extremists. And I just think this has to go part and parcel with the discussion on how accurate the technology is. Is the policy of these targeted strikes against individuals who are integral in the society that they live in actually going to result in an increase in security in the world? I don't think it is.
Christopher, I think that's a really excellent answer. And I'm going to skip ahead to a question I was going to ask later because of it, because I do think there is the one question about when we get it wrong, when we get civilians. But I think there's a larger question. And like I mentioned at the beginning, that Defending Rights and Dissent, as has, like, I believe all human rights and civil liberties groups, has opposed targeted killing programs because they constitute illegal forms of extrajudicial execution that violate international law. They violate the Constitution when they're done to U.S. citizens. So I guess the question is, can the lethal use of drones, can so-called targeted killings ever be justified? Is this a justifiable and I know we want to distinguish between like drones as surveillance and drones as assassins. So I don't want to say drone program overall, but can sort of the global targeted killing program of which drones is a part, is this a program that can be justified?
I don't think it is. If I can just chime in. I think we've given it 20 years, 25 years, really. I mean, this goes back to the mid to late 90s in Kosovo is when we really started to use this technology. I think it's proven to not be effective ultimately. And I agree with you. I think this is a violation of international law. This is unauthorized assassination. There at least needs to be more discussion about this, and it's just not being discussed. It's unless you're in our circles. This needs to go back up to some broader discussion in our government.
Thank you for that. Sean, you looked like you also had an answer. You looked contemplative.
Coming from a technological standpoint, I'm watching as all this infrastructure is going up around the world. We're pretty soon going to have satellites blanketing the globe. It's pissing off astronomers right now, and I think it's important to watch these sorts of developments and really just focus on, what we're enabling for the future and what the, what missions in the future might entail. Because, right now a big problem with like the footage was limited bandwidth. It wasn't necessarily the cameras were bad. It was the signal between the drone itself and operators. There was quite a bit of steps in between, but as well as it just wasn't enough bandwidth. Bandwidth is increasingly going to become less of a problem, but it's you can have the clearest image. You can see somebody's cigarette in their mouth, and you're still going to be looking from 15,000 feet down on the ground, and you're still going to be looking at reality through a mediated lens. And increasingly, that's going to entail the use of algorithms, because there is this issue of like producing too much surveillance photo or having too much surveillance photo for enough analysts to really pilfer through. So it's problematic in that respect, because if you ask any data scientists, they'll tell you that like one of the biggest issues in data science is bias. It's really hard to eliminate bias, and you have to ask yourself where this data is coming from, what the context of it, if it had any context, and if it didn't have any context, what context you're labeling it with in the future. So in the way that the US uses it, like extrajudicial killings in places that we haven't even formally declared war on, very dangerous precedent. And if the US thinks it's the only country that's going to do that, I think they're so sorely mistaken. And we have an opportunity right now to create a good precedent, which is like we need to be critical of the weapons that we put on drones, because as we start to automate them, like you can't. It's a lot harder to monitor software updates than it is to monitor hardware. It's really the only chance we have. But I don't think that it is an appropriate, weapon for, the way that the U.S. has been using it, just in general. That's, yeah.
Okay, Kagan, is the drones... lethal drones, are they justifiable?
I don't ever want to say no, but I totally agree with Christopher's point. Like, we knew this when, you know, the surge happened and Petraeus and McChrystal and everybody was going on about how, you know, the model that we were using weren't working and we needed to change hearts and minds, because they would even admit, like, every person that we killed creates 10 to 25 more people that want to fight against us. And even more so when you're not in a combat situation, like when it is just you're, you know, hovering 30,000 feet above somebody and then they're just doing whatever they're doing. And like, that makes it even more of a shock to the people on the ground. And like, as Lisa said, if that is your only interaction with America, what are you going to do? How are you going to feel about that? Of course you're going to be negative. Of course you're going to do something, especially if it's your family member. You're going to want to do something. And so if we want to stop that mentality, if we want to actually end terrorism, we're not going to do it by killing people. We're only going to do it by improving their situation on the ground, by like actually making their lives better, actually helping them in the way that they need and the way that they want, instead of doing what we always do and doing it in the way that America wants to do, or whoever is going to be the one using this program, because we're not the only ones, and there's more and more people using them every year. Turkey just used a bunch in their war with Azerbaijan and in their little skirmish with Syria. And, you know, it's becoming this way of the future for war, because it protects the nation that is doing the aggression in a way that war doesn't, and especially when it's troops on the ground. And so we just have to be really, really careful about how we're going to use any kind of force in any manner.
And then Lisa.
So I just want to put a plug in real quick about Germany. Right now they're having what they've called the drone debates. They've been having these debates for a long time within their Bundestag, and they've just had an election. And basically, what I personally believe is that when you arm drones, their mission changes. They're no longer troop overwatch. They're no longer surveillance. They're basically assassination or killing machines, right? And I think that there is something that we can actually do. I think that we can actually, with Germany's help, not weaponize the drones that fly over and prosecute terror. And we can't fight. I mean, it's crazy to think that we can fight a war on terror with more terror. And armed drones are terror by their very definition. And so, that being said, the idea that these devices can protect troops, I mean, there's a big pink elephant in the room, a question that nobody has asked. I've never heard it. Has a drone killed a troop? And why don't we know? So, I mean, the idea that this kind of technology is going to make troops safer, is going to make anybody safer, is going to make the world more peaceful, is ever going to be justified, not in my view. Terror is never justified.
Thank you very much for that answer. Before I ask my next question, I just want to reiterate the disclaimer I gave at the beginning that none of today's guests will be discussing classified or otherwise protected national defense information. I'm familiar with the drone program, but drones are not an issue I work on with regularity. I was obviously very horrified when Obama announced he was going to kill a U.S. citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, and I was very disturbed when we killed his 16-year-old son. I posted about it on election night 2012 on my Facebook, and people didn't appreciate that I did that. But I don't understand all of the ins and outs of the drone program. And is it a singular program? What agencies are involved? You know, how do they sort of play with each other? And I'm asking this based off of, you know, what we know publicly. That is all I'm asking. You all, people who are experts, who study the public record, what is the drone program? What is the targeted killing program, and who is involved in it?
So I can take that one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of public information out there that has been kind of hidden over time, right? Because there's always a time when we need to put something out in the world about a partnership, about any number of things, to garner support so that it can be funded. And if you look online and you can see the public information that's out there, you'll start to understand that. But a more important question is, why doesn't the public know? Why don't we know? I mean, the military comes with some set rules and regulations, the law of armed conflict, you know, it operates within international humanitarian law outside of war zones. But like the NSA, the CIA, the other three-letter agencies, they don't even need to tell us they've struck. The scope of the drone program is immense, and it's growing. It's growing exponentially. And the only thing that is used as oversight or as regulation or, you know, as a regime is the missile regime. And that does not address either the technology that's involved in this huge, massive program. I mean, just think Australia was recently with the whole submarine thing. That's all about mission systems. That's all about, and all of this information is public for people that want to dig and people that want to look. And yeah, so I mean, it's immense in its scope, it's immense in its power. And if people, you know, and it's growing without regulation and without oversight. And I can't tell you how many times during the hearing they said, oh, we can only say that in a classified briefing. We can only say that in a classified briefing. To tell the public what agency is responsible for what is not sources and methods. It's holding people accountable and responsible. So that's it.
And I guess there's my follow-up is as I know the military conducts drone strikes. I know the CIA conducts drone strikes. Are these all one program, or are these separate sort of competing or complementary entities and agencies with their own drone programs? I don't know if that's a dumb question or not, but I'm just really curious about this.
I would call it the military intelligence industrial complex.
Okay. So I guess once again, going only off of what's in the public record, you know, we used to read about terror. Oh, Sean, did you want to answer this?
Sure.
You just unmuted yourself, is all.
Oh, yeah.
So I assumed that was coming to answer that. I wasn't trying to like cold call on you. This is not like school. You unmuted yourself, and I want to stop talking if you were about to answer it. But if you didn't want to, I can move on.
Of course, there's. I mean, you have to look at the different forms of intelligence that are derived from these drones. I mean, you have, you know, a whole assortment. Like signals intelligence could like also include electronic intelligence. I mean, it's. I mean, you're not only talking about different intelligence agencies, but you're also talking about different nations, and you're talking about Five Eyes or Nine Eyes. It all depends on who they're targeting, where they're targeting, and like what source of information that they have that they are going off of. I think, generally you could speak to that. Yeah, that's all I was really going to say.
Before I move on to my second part of this question, does anyone else wanna take this one? I know it's a wonky question, but as I was just preparing all the questions and stuff and looking at all your bios, and I remember there was controversy when Trump was going to let the CIA do drone strikes without prior approval, and then Biden put some things. It just sort of dawned on me that I really don't have a great sense of the totality of the drone program, and I think, not to be sort of arrogant, I think I know more than a lot of people who are just following these issues, or aren't following these issues, and I was just wanted to try to demystify it a little bit.
I think something that's really interesting that we should talk about. Oh, I mean, there's this idea of mission creep in the fact that there are many people using this program, and it's, it depends on what the mission is. But it's been really frustrating to see that it's because it's seen as effective by the people that love this program. They are gonna, I mean, why wouldn't you use that? Like that, again, because the end goal, I feel like, is to take the human element of putting Americans in harm's way, or whoever nation is using them to put their soldiers or service members out of harm's way. They're gonna want to pursue this technology. So, why wouldn't people use it? And when they look at it from that lens, that's where it can really spread. And that should be concerning to anybody who cares, again, about human rights, about people's ability to determine what we're doing or what they're doing for themselves.
And I guess my next question is, like, who is ultimately in charge here? I remember during the Obama years, we hear these reports about Terror Tuesday, where they would sit there with these baseball cards of suspected terrorists and pick people to kill. But I was also given an estimate by someone of how many people who were on the kill list, and it was an astonishingly large number. My jaw hit the floor, and we've heard stories of CIA carrying out strikes without any sort of approval. Is there someone in charge here? Is there any sort of control on this program, or is it just sort of a life of its own at this point?
I'm going to say yes and no. And that's trying to be as open as I can be and as accurate as I can be, which is that you have many entities with many hands in many pots. And depending on which entity and which pot we're talking about may have a certain level of control, certain level of approval. And within another entity dealing with another pot, there may be a significantly lesser amount of approval and control. And if that sounds generic and vague, that's about right.
I understand why. Any other thoughts before I move on to or before we go to the next question?
I have one more thought.
Yeah.
I'd like you to answer who is in charge of the internet.
No one. I don't know.
Connected devices are connected devices. That's what they are. They're connected devices. Your refrigerator can talk to your toaster. Your drone can talk to an analyst. I don't see the difference.
That's horrifying.
And there have been reports, right, where, look at what just happened with Australia. I mean, to my way of thinking, they recently were assimilated.
I'm sorry. That analogy to the internet. It's very unsettling, but I understand the point. My next question for you is, as I know some congressional offices have expressed interest in this program and this broadcast, and that some of the staff are planning to watch, probably not live because of everything that's happening on Capitol Hill. What is your advice to Congress? What should Congress do?
I think they need to demand more answers. I mean, the biggest thing that I care about is transparency. And ultimately, if we want to say that we have a free and transparent government, then we need to actually follow up with that. And if we want to say that we are citizens of the world, like we are a player on the world stage, that means that we're also answerable to everybody. And if we don't do our part, if Congress doesn't do their part to demand answers and demand transparency in whatever capacity that means, but to demand real answers so they can actually understand the scope, then I don't think anybody's doing their job.
Thank you. Sean, what would you say to Congress?
I know that we filled out an amicus brief, it was either 2016 or 2017. Faisal bin Ali Jabber, who had his uncle killed in a strike in Yemen, actually brought it before them, and the judge ruled that there's no legal body that can really, investigate this within the United States outside of the FISA court. And I think that's wrong. There needs to be some sort of external oversight body that can really investigate this, because otherwise, it's going to keep happening. But I'm also we need to reevaluate this whole global war on terror. And I mean, I've heard people say this, I've said it, but like, you can't fight terrorism with something that is equatable to terrorism. We've experienced 9/11 back in 2001, and it was really traumatic for us. I mean, a lot of these people are experiencing 9/11 every day, sometimes multiple times a day, and that's something to really think about. And just also think about the conditions these people are facing. And when you start destroying infrastructure, it takes funds to rebuild that infrastructure. You can't manage your land properly, you can't grow crops properly, you can't do these things you need to live properly, and it ultimately results in failed states, and which breeds more resentment and more desperate people who have to turn towards things that they might have not otherwise turned towards. So really start looking at the underlying causes of things and start critically analyzing the profit incentives of doing this for the United States, because I mean, not everybody's benefiting from it here. And I think that's becoming more and more apparent.
And then Keegan, do you have advice for Congress?
Oh, I went already.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Christopher. I was thinking Christopher. Christopher, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. My message for Congress is Newton's second law. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And Sean was saying it, so I'm just restating it in another way. But I think we really need to look deeply at whether or not, if in the future a society hates us, or a society as a whole has significant members within it that are opposite to our way of life here in the West, can we stop that by dropping bombs on them? And I would say the answer has proven to be no. And so I think we really need, as a society and as a Congress, to look at what are other possible ways. We've seen one way, it doesn't work. We might as well try something new next, is what I'm saying.
Thank you for that. Lisa, what's your advice to Congress?
So I just want to say two things. One is, I had a conversation with Daniel Hale. And he's in prison for, one of the things that he handed out was not classified, but the government wouldn't hand it out. And that was how people got on the no-fly list. And I don't think a lot of people know that about him. And he also talked about the targeted assassination process. And I don't think what he did was wrong. I think the law that put him in prison is wrong. And the fact that there is no way for anyone in the intelligence community, if you see a bank doing wrong, there's all kinds of ways you can not only blow the whistle, but you are incentivized with financial rewards for doing so. When it comes to the intelligence community, you have to hurdle over mouse turds to, if you actually can figure out from inside this secretive place how to report something. And when the Iraq war was going on, I was watching people blow the whistle on a whole lot of bad that was going on in Iraq, a whole lot of illegality, abuse, squandering of funds, just all of it. And I was watching absolutely nothing happen because there was no oversight. I think that what I would ask Congress to do is give me a door. Give me a doorway and an effect, so that if I come from inside any of these secret agencies and speak to you, I'd like to see some action taken, or at least a response other than the Glomar response done. And the other thing that I would like to say is that the missile technology control regime is what is basically the regime that controls this program. A missile and a drone are different. The system that guides missiles and the system that guides drones are different. This regime does not cover what is happening now, what is happening today. And it certainly won't cover the things that are happening in our future. Just recently, the first device used a human-machine interface was given to a person within this year. And those devices and those interfaces and those pieces of technology will eventually be used for war, because within a colonial construct, this is how computers and electronics and communications and all of that type of equipment evolves, right? It's how money gets funded for it, for health or war. And I think that we need to take a look at, the artificial intelligence that's coming down the road and all of these things that are designed to remove the fog of war. That's what they're touting, that this equipment and that this technology will do. And what was evidenced in the Kabul strike is that with the entire world watching, with a whole bunch of reporters on the ground, with all that we have, that we tout, that we know, that mistake was so far mistake. It's not a mistake. It's a systemic error. It's a systemic malfunction on a system that I would really like to see Congress question deeper, even though we all know that the arms trade, pours money into congressional communities. We need to just not look at that for a little bit, not look at the financial thing, and start paying attention to humanity during this technological revolution.
And then I guess I have a follow-up question. Have any of you ever been called to testify or asked to testify before any congressional committee?
Not in this country, no.
In Germany, though, yes. Right, yeah. So I guess my advice to Congress, if I can insert myself into the panel, is that when they have these hearings about drone strikes, when they have these hearings about U.S. foreign policies, instead of just bringing the same old generals and public officials up again and again, why not have some of the people on this panel testify, or any of the other people who have participated in the drone programs, who have been in the grounds of our wars? And I remember when Iraq Veterans Against the War did Winter Soldier, right? That's not the drone program, but it's similar voices we should be hearing in these things, or even people who have lived on the other side of U.S. foreign policy. So my advice to Congress, if you want to know what went wrong in the Kabul strike, talk to the drone whistleblowers, put them up on the stand and hear their words and listen to them. I want to give you all a chance to plug any projects you're working on, any groups you're involved with that you think the viewers at home should support, an activist group, a book you're working on, any of those things. Pretty broad. I really appreciate you giving us an hour and 20 minutes of your time for what is a dark topic. And I just wanted to give you each a chance to alert people about any sort of organizations or projects that they should know about. Lisa, I'll start with you since you're at the bottom of my screen, but number one on my question list.
So Sean and I wrote a chapter, and actually Brandon Bryant, another drone whistleblower, the first one to come out, also wrote a chapter. And Billy Winter Davis, Reality Winner's mom, a lot of people don't know that Reality Winner was also in the drone program, wrote a chapter for this book by Disruption Labs. And it's www.disruptionlab.org/book. And I really hope that people will read it, because it's, you know, it's about how the idea of whistleblowing, it's a really deep dive into how it can affect change.
Thank you for that. And then right above Lisa on my screen was Christopher. Yes.
Yeah, I think people should check out. There's a new book that just came out by Eyal Press, which is spelled Press. He's an author for the New York Times. He wrote a book called Dirty Work, which has an entire chapter dedicated to the drone program. I think that's worth checking out. And also, I would encourage people to support their local chapters of Veterans for Peace. Even if you're not a veteran yourself, you can support the chapter. They have an associate membership, and almost every major city around the U.S. and around the world has a chapter. They're very important for changing the hearts and minds of the people around the world.
Veterans for Peace are a phenomenal organization. I first encountered them at the September 2005 march against the Iraq War in Washington, D.C., and just fantastic people. I've worked with them on so many issues, independent of my DRAD work, on Iraq, on Palestine, just so many things. And they are such a really strong group. I really do encourage people to support them. Sean.
Well, so one of the crimes of our justice system is they just charge an arm and a leg for making phone calls to prison. I mean, it's, you know, somebody could easily burn through about $500 a week just like trying to keep in contact with people back home, and there really is no reason for it. You know, it doesn't cost a lot of money to send an email. It doesn't cost a lot of money to, you know, send a phone call from prison. So it is quite a racket. But if you could donate to the GoFundMe for, I believe it's a GoFundMe for Daniel Hale, the whistleblower who is in prison right now. And if you want, write letters for him. The other thing is just that the crisis of the border is not ended. It's ongoing. And right now, I mean, the Haitians are, you know, like they're getting treated quite poorly. And try to understand like why these people are refugees in the first place, and you know, some of the history with the United States and other countries in these places. You might find that, you know, maybe like we have, I mean, at least our government has you know, a responsibility to help these people. I mean, asylum is a human right. There's no reason you should be sent back to your country if you have a legitimate asylum claim. And there's a lot of different organizations that are working on this. I know that there's legal organizations that help with lawsuits, you know, that are defending migrants. There's organizations helping with medical support. The hospitals are overloaded right now. I know, like in Tijuana, there's a organization called Justicia en Salud. And it's just an organization of midwives that will actually see migrants because they often get turned away at the hospital. So it's just, yeah, I know that it's COVID, and I know that it's like, you know, it's a lot, but I mean, you know, we have to keep attention on these things that would often just go in the dark, or else it's just going to get worse. I mean, shine the light on darkness.
And thank you, Sean. And I would also encourage people, if they can, to give to Daniel Hale's GoFundMe. I know sometimes NGOs can be quite territorial about funding, but Defending Rights and Dissent has shared his GoFundMe page on our Twitter, on our Facebook. I've never been on Instagram, but I assume it's on our Instagram as well. And like, we have not shied away from supporting his personal GoFundMe, because I mean, what the U.S. government did to Daniel is just, it's horrible. And if people can support him on a personal level, it's important that we do so. Kagan.
So along with Veterans for Peace, there's another intersectional veteran group called About Face, Veterans Against the War, which I'm a member of. Like Veterans for Peace, they also take non-veterans. They do a lot of wonderful stuff, and I really like being a part of them. I have a podcast with two other veterans, one of which is one of the spokespeople for Veterans for Peace and for About Face, Danny Serson and Chris Henriksen and myself. We just kind of talk about foreign policy. We talk about the military. We talk about just what's going on in the circles that we don't talk that much about in American society. And it's, I know it's a bunch of three white guys talking about veteran stuff, but it's if anyone wants to take a listen, it's on every podcast. It's called Fortress on a Hill.
And Kagan, About Face, that's the group that used to be called Iraq Veterans Against the War, or Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah, they're a fantastic group. I used to organize speaking when I was in high school. I used to organize some speaking events for members of what was then Iraq Veterans Against the War. And I got into a fight with my high school principal about whether or not I could bring one of their speakers to speak at my school, and for an after-school club. And we had a big fight about that. And that is why I care so much about the First Amendment, and why I am sitting here with Defending Rights and Dissent. I would also encourage people to check out the website rightsanddissent.org. That is the website of Defending Rights and Dissent. We've been working very strong against the Espionage Act. We helped to draft legislation in the last session of Congress to reform the Espionage Act. We worked with other First Amendment attorneys, whistleblowers themselves, to come up with language that we think would make it far more difficult. We organized the first protest for Chelsea Manning. We've organized protests for Reality Winner on World Whistleblower Day. We were involved with Hale. We were involved with Snowden. We're very, very concerned about the Assange case. Concern is an understatement now that we know the CIA wanted to kill him. And we do other work as well on all kinds of issues around FBI surveillance, around Islamophobia. And we have an entire podcast called Primary Sources that you can visit at primarysourcespodcast.org, where every week almost, or not every episode, we highlight a different whistleblower, except for one week we brought on a historian of the Espionage Act, but we've had Dan Ellsberg on, we've had Tom Drake on, and we do what we did on this segment tonight, where we sit down and just sort of talk about talk to them, how they got to their position, what they saw that bothered them, what their life was like after that. And, Dan Ellsberg, Tom Drake, they have John Kiker, they have pretty amazing stories. Kagan, your podcast is called Fortress on a Hill, right? So everyone check out Fortress on a Hill. Everyone check out Primary Sources and all those groups. And we're a little over time, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to allow each of you to share a final thought for our viewers. And we'll go in the reverse order of last time. So we'll start with Kagan.
I just really want everyone to think about, if you care about the things that we talk about in the Constitution, if we care about people, if we care about humanity, we need to be very aware of how and when we're using force. And when it's justified and when it's not justified. And when all of that is in an enclosed system that is designed to continue itself, there's always going to be a justification for doing what you're doing. And so there's always a need for oversight. There's always a need for regulation. There's always a need for other voices who are outside of that sphere doing the work to be able to ask the tough questions that sometimes the people in that system don't ever want to ask. And it's absolutely necessary for us to do that.
And then next was Sean. Yes, Sean.
I think it's important for all of us to understand what's being done in our name, and we need to take accountability for it. I know that all of us do. We were personally involved with it, but I mean, apathy, is, just almost just as bad. It's if you think COVID is bad, having to stay indoors, having to watch who you're talking to, everything like that. I mean, that's what people in war zones are having to deal with every day. I mean, this is just like a little taste of how rough it is. Like, nobody in the United States has any clue how difficult it is to live when you have drones flying over your head and people fighting in the streets, and except for maybe some indigenous people or certain communities. But I think empathy, that's something that's sorely amiss in this country, and don't be afraid to cultivate it.
And then Christopher, final thoughts.
Yeah, Chip, thank you so much for what you're doing. This is really important. I just want to let you know that too. And I think that we as a society need to express outrage at what our politicians, what our military leaders are doing here and have done, especially with this most recent strike. We need to feel outrage, both for the human lives that have been lost on both sides of the conflict, and also because this policy of perpetual war that we as a country have seemed to have been in really since the Korean War, where for the last 70 years here, every 10 years or so, we're fighting an unwinnable war, which can only be called a policy if one is really looking at it objectively. That policy of unwinnable war is hurting not only the people that we're fighting against, it's hurting us, even here sitting in the safety of our own homes in the United States. It's hurting us because it is siphoning all of our resources toward the purpose of destruction on the other side of the planet. And if we had those resources to use for the betterment of ourselves, for the betterment of our common human being, whether in this country or in another country, it would uplift us all as a civilization. And I think that's something that we need to be outraged that our politicians are implementing this policy in our names.
Thank you, Christopher. And Lisa. Lisa, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Chip, for having us on and participating in such a crucial conversation. I want to say that, there are people that have been harmed by the laws against being able to tell the truth. And one of them is Daniel Hale. And the other one is, for right now, is Reality Winner. And there are so many other people that are in our prison industrial complex. It's a whole other thing. And I think that we need to, just kind of pay. I think everybody's right. We really need to come back to humanity. I mean, these machine-mediated conversations and, all this, revering technology and all of that stuff, there is nothing better than, cultivating relationships with other people from other countries And, you know, we complain about the things that are happening at the border, but not once do we look in the mirror as a nation and realize that as long as we are going to be bombing countries, then people are going to want to come and people are going to want to escape. And we need to, you know, get down to the root causes of the conditions that we see complained about really so often. So thanks again, Chip.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for joining us, for talking about what I know is a really dark and emotional topic. I was interviewing a whistleblower for the podcast we do, and he was talking about how for a while he would hedge what he would say because he wanted to be a great public servant and didn't want to say too much and alienate people in the government. And now he stopped on that. And I said, you know, I think what you're doing right now is being a great public servant. I think telling the people the truth that you know is a great public service. And I want to really thank you all for sharing the truth with us, because I think that is a service. And I know it's not an easy one, either emotionally, either professionally. I know there's all kinds of things to worry about. And I just really appreciate you having the courage and the willingness to take the time and spend this evening with us talking about this horrific, murderous strike. I'm sure you could all be doing more pleasant things than this. And, you know, I've been at Defending Rights and Dissent for 6 years. I joined September the 5th, 2015. I think that's 6 years. I've worked on issues with ag-gag laws, with silencing people who support Palestine, with protesters' rights, with facial recognition, and the work we've done around whistleblowers, some of which I was involved in before I joined. I mentioned, you know, I was involved with Chelsea Manning support stuff back in 2013, 2011, has really been the most personally meaningful to me. And it's not because it's a pleasant topic, because we're looking at really horrific crimes being exposed, and we're looking at people standing up and telling the truth. And in many cases, like Daniel Hale, the reality winner, Chelsea Manning, facing really unfathomable persecution just for telling us about these terrible crimes. So this has been, you know, to me, the most meaningful work I've done in my life, and this has been one of the most personally important one of these panels I chaired. I really just appreciate all of you for joining us, and I'm going to close out now. Defending Rights and Dissent is an organization that defends your right to know and your freedom to act, and for that reason, we were morally obligated to bring you these voices tonight of people who have the courage to speak out about the drone program, who aren't always being listened to by our media, who aren't always being listened to by our politicians, but whose voices are vitally important. Have a good night, everyone, and really think about what you've heard tonight, and reach out to your lawmaker and tell them what you're concerned about.